That old woman is just the maid. Don't bother explaining anything to her, my daughter-in-law said, right in front of me, as if I weren't standing 3 feet away holding a basket of groceries I was about to pay for. I didn't correct her. I didn't even look at her. I just stood there, feeling the fluorescent lights of the store hum above me, the quiet shuffle of carts around us, and the sudden, uncomfortable pause in the cashier's smile as her eyes flickered between Vanessa and me. I remember thinking how ordinary the moment had been just seconds before. We had driven to the grocery store like we did every Saturday morning, the same one 10 minutes from the house, the one where I knew which aisle carried the good coffee and which shelf had the bread Daniel liked. I had picked out fresh produce, checked expiration dates, compared prices, small habits built over decades of running a household. Old habits don't leave you just because someone decides you no longer belong. Vanessa had been scrolling on her phone most of the time, occasionally dropping items into the cart without looking, expensive things she never checked the price of. I didn't say anything. I rarely did anymore. By the time we reached the register, I had already taken out my wallet, the same brown leather one I'd carried for years, worn soft at the edges. The cashier greeted us with a polite smile, the kind that doesn't linger too long. She started scanning items, one after another, the beeping steady and predictable, until she looked up and asked a simple question about a store discount. That's when Vanessa laughed lightly, tilting her head as if she were sharing a harmless joke. "Oh, don't worry about explaining it to her," she said, her voice smooth and casual. "She's just the maid." The word hung there for a second too long. The cashier blinked, uncertain, then gave a small nod, her expression shifting into something more careful, more distant. She stopped addressing me directly after that. Every question was redirected to Vanessa. Every receipt detail was explained to her. I noticed the change immediately, not because it was loud, but because it was so quiet. That's how disrespect works most of the time. It doesn't shout. It settles into the space between people and rearranges it. I placed my wallet back into my purse without using it. Vanessa tapped her card against the machine without hesitation, like she always did, like money appeared for her the same way the groceries did, without effort, without thought. As we walked out, she slipped on her sunglasses and asked me if I had remembered to grab the brand of yogurt she liked. Her tone was normal, almost cheerful, as if nothing had happened, as if she hadn't just erased me in front of a stranger. I nodded and said yes. My voice sounded steady. It surprised even me. The parking lot was warm, the kind of mild afternoon that usually felt comforting. I loaded the groceries into the trunk while Vanessa stood to the side, checking her messages. The same routine, the same roles. Only now, something had shifted in a way I couldn't ignore anymore. Because that wasn't the first time. It was just the first time she said it out loud, where someone else could hear it, believe it, and act on it. And what unsettled me more than her words was this. Daniel had been there the entire time, standing just behind us in line. And he hadn't said a single word. Daniel followed us out to the parking lot, but he stayed a few steps behind, as if there was an invisible line he did not want to cross. And I could feel it without turning around, that quiet distance that had grown over the years, one small moment at a time, until it became something permanent and hard to name. I placed the last bag into the trunk and closed it gently, taking a second longer than necessary, just to steady my hands. Then I walked to the passenger side and got in without waiting for either of them. The car smelled faintly of Vanessa's perfume, something expensive and floral that lingered too long in enclosed spaces. She started the engine, music playing softly from the radio, and began talking about a dinner she wanted to host next weekend. Something about inviting her friends over, people I had never met but had heard about often enough to know they mattered more than I did. I listened without interrupting, nodding at the right moments, answering when she asked if we had enough serving dishes, if the dining table could seat 8 comfortably, if the house would look presentable. She said the word house, but I noticed she did not say our house or even Daniel's house, just house, like it was already something detached, something that belonged to an idea rather than a person. Daniel sat in the back seat, scrolling through his phone, occasionally glancing up, but never quite meeting my eyes in the rearview mirror, and I wondered when that had started, when my son began looking at me like a stranger he felt responsible for, but did not quite know how to engage with. The drive home took 15 minutes, the same familiar streets, the same stoplights, the same turn onto Maple Ridge Drive where the trees lined both sides like they always had, but everything felt slightly altered, as if the world had shifted by a fraction and I was the only one who noticed. When we pulled into the driveway, I stepped out first and went straight to the front door, unlocking it with the same key I had used for over 30 years, the metal worn smooth from use, the weight of it familiar in my hand. Inside, the house was quiet, the kind of quiet that used to feel peaceful but now felt empty, like it was waiting for something that never quite arrived. I carried the groceries into the kitchen, setting them on the counter in the same order I always did, produce first, then refrigerated items, then pantry goods, each movement deliberate, controlled, the rhythm of routine holding me together. Vanessa walked in behind me, talking about decorations, about candles and table settings, about how she wanted everything to look perfect, and I realized she was not speaking to me as someone who lived here, but as someone who was expected to make it happen. "Can you handle all of that by Friday?" she asked, already halfway out of the kitchen, not waiting for my answer, assuming it would be yes. I said yes anyway, softly, more to myself than to her. Daniel lingered in the doorway for a moment, as if he might say something, as if there was still a part of him that recognized what had happened earlier, but then he simply nodded once and followed his wife upstairs. I stood there alone, my hands resting on the cool granite countertop, listening to their footsteps fade, and for the first time, I did not feel surprised. I felt something else instead. Something quieter, steadier, like a realization settling into place. Because that morning at the store had not created anything new. It had only revealed what had already been there all along. I did not cry that afternoon, not when I unpacked the groceries, not when I placed each item into its proper place. Not even when I caught my reflection in the kitchen window and noticed how small I looked standing in a house I once filled with noise and purpose, because something inside me had gone past tears and settled into a kind of quiet awareness that felt sharper than any pain. I moved through the house slowly, the way I always had, straightening a chair that did not need straightening, adjusting a picture frame that had not moved, small gestures that used to feel like care, but now felt like maintenance, as if I were preserving something that no longer included me. Upstairs, I could hear Vanessa's voice drifting down the hallway, bright and animated as she spoke on the phone, describing her plans for the dinner, the menu, the guest list, the details that mattered to her. And then I heard it again, that same light laugh, followed by words that made me pause at the bottom of the staircase. "No, she will take care of everything," Vanessa said, her tone effortless, casual. "She always does. It is basically like having live-in help." There was a short pause, then a softer laugh. "No, she is not really involved. She just stays here." I stood there without moving, one hand resting lightly on the banister, listening not because I wanted to, but because I could not unhear what had already been said. It was not the first time she had spoken about me like that, I realized, only the first time I had allowed myself to recognize it clearly, without excuses, without softening it into something more acceptable. I turned away before she could come down and see me standing there, and I went back into the kitchen, wiping a clean counter with a cloth just to give my hands something to do. For years, I had explained things away. Vanessa is young, I would think. She does not understand. She is stressed. She does not mean it the way it sounds. But the truth does not change just because you choose not to look at it. The truth waits. It repeats itself. It becomes a pattern. I began to see that pattern everywhere once I allowed myself to notice. The way she introduced me to people as Daniel's mother, but never used my name. The way she would interrupt me mid-sentence and redirect the conversation. The way decisions about the house were made without me, even though I was always expected to carry them out. Even Daniel's silence had a pattern to it, a steady absence that said more than any words could have. He was not cruel. He was not unkind. He was simply absent in the moments that mattered, and that absence created space for everything else to grow unchecked. I placed the last item into the refrigerator and closed the door gently, the soft click echoing in the quiet kitchen, and for a moment I stood there with my hand resting on the handle, feeling the cool surface beneath my palm, grounding myself in something real, something solid. Because if I was going to understand what was happening, I needed to stop pretending it was temporary. This was not a misunderstanding. It was not a phase. It was a structure that had been built slowly, carefully, piece by piece, until it became normal for them and invisible to me. And once I saw it, truly saw it, I knew one thing with absolute clarity. I had not been pushed out all at once. I had been replaced, one small moment at a time, until there was nothing left of the place I used to hold. I went upstairs later that evening, not to confront anyone, not to ask questions, but simply because I needed to see the house from their perspective, to understand how something I had built with such care could feel so unfamiliar to me now. And as I reached the top of the staircase, I paused in the hallway, looking at the framed photos that lined the wall. Moments frozen in time that told a version of our life that no longer seemed entirely true. There was one of Daniel as a boy, no older than 8, standing in the backyard with dirt on his knees and a grin that took up his whole face. The same backyard I had spent summers tending, planting flowers along the fence line, making sure he had a place that felt safe, a place that felt like home. Next to it was a picture from his college graduation, my arm around his shoulders, pride shining in my eyes, the kind of pride that comes from years of quiet sacrifice, from working late nights, from putting someone else's future ahead of your own without ever questioning it. And then there were the newer photos, the ones Vanessa had chosen, carefully arranged, showing dinner parties, vacations, smiling faces gathered around tables I had set, in rooms I had maintained, images where I was either absent or placed just at the edge, as if I had already begun fading from the center long before I noticed it myself. I stepped into what used to be Daniel's room, now transformed into a guest space that I was rarely invited to enter. The furniture replaced, the colors neutral, nothing left that hinted at the life that had once filled it, and I realized how easily a space can be rewritten when the person who remembers its history is no longer consulted. Down the hall, their bedroom door was slightly ajar, and I could hear their voices again, softer this time, but still clear enough that I did not need to strain. "We should start looking at places soon," Vanessa said, her tone practical, almost businesslike. "Somewhere smaller would be better for her. It is not safe for someone her age to be in a house like this alone." There was a brief silence, and then Daniel's voice, lower, uncertain. "She is not alone. She is with us." Vanessa exhaled, a small sound that carried more impatience than anger. "For now, but it is not sustainable. You know that. We cannot keep adjusting everything around her." I stood there, listening, not with shock, but with a growing sense of clarity, as if each word was fitting into a pattern I had already begun to recognize. They were not reacting to me. They were planning around me. There is a difference, and once you see it, you cannot unsee it. I stepped back quietly before the conversation could continue, returning to my room at the end of the hall, the one space that still held traces of who I had been before all of this shifted, and I sat on the edge of the bed, looking at my hands resting in my lap, the same hands that had signed mortgage papers decades ago, the same hands that had written checks, cooked meals, fixed small things before they became big problems. I thought about the word she had used earlier, maid, how easily it had come to her, how naturally it had fit into the role she had already assigned me, and I understood then that this was not just about disrespect. It was about replacement, about redefining me into something smaller so that there would be room for something else to take my place. But what they did not seem to understand, what they had overlooked in all their careful planning, was that I had not forgotten who I was, even if they had chosen to. And the house they were discussing so casually, the one they were already imagining without me in it, still held a history that did not belong to them, no matter how quietly they tried to rewrite it. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual, not because I had something urgent to do, but because my mind had already settled into a quiet determination that would not let me sleep any longer. And for the first time in a long while, I did not feel lost in my own home. I felt alert, present, aware of every detail around me, as if I were seeing it clearly after years of looking through something fogged and distant. I made my coffee the same way I always did, measuring it carefully, letting it brew slowly, standing by the kitchen window as the early light filtered through the trees outside, casting soft shadows across the counter. And I realized how many mornings I had spent here, how many routines I had built into the rhythm of this house, routines that had quietly supported everyone else's lives while mine faded into the background. Vanessa came downstairs around 8, her footsteps light but purposeful, already dressed, already moving as if the day belonged entirely to her, and she gave me a brief smile, the kind that acknowledged my presence without truly seeing me. "Good morning," she said, reaching for a glass of water, then pausing just long enough to add, "We should go over the shopping list again later. I want everything perfect for Saturday." I nodded, taking a sip of my coffee, my expression calm, unchanged, and she continued speaking, listing items, decorations, small details that she assumed I would take care of, the same way she assumed I would handle everything else that kept her world running smoothly. Daniel joined a few minutes later, his tie slightly crooked, his attention already divided between his phone and the day ahead, and he greeted me with a quick, "Morning, Mom," before sitting down at the table, barely looking up as Vanessa updated him on her plans, her voice confident, assured, certain that everything would fall into place exactly as she intended. I watched them both in silence, not with resentment, but with a kind of clarity that felt almost unfamiliar, because I was no longer trying to interpret their behavior in a way that made it easier to accept. I was simply observing it as it was. When they finished breakfast and left the house, the front door closing with a soft click behind them, I stood there for a moment, listening to the quiet that followed, and then I did something I had not done in years. I went to the small desk in the corner of the living room, the one that still held old folders, documents, papers I had kept organized long before Vanessa ever stepped into this house, and I opened the bottom drawer slowly, as if I were opening something more than just a piece of furniture. Inside were the records of a life they seemed to have forgotten, mortgage documents, bank statements, insurance policies, papers with my name written clearly across them, not as a detail, not as an afterthought, but as the primary name, the owner, the one who had built the foundation they were now standing on without question. I sat down and began to go through them one by one, not hurriedly, not emotionally, but carefully, methodically, reading each line as if I were reacquainting myself with something I had once known by heart. It did not take long for the truth to settle into place, not as a surprise, but as a confirmation of something I had already begun to understand. The house they were discussing, the future they were planning, the decisions they were making without me, none of it existed without the structure I had put in place years ago. And for the first time since that moment in the store, since that word had been spoken so casually in front of a stranger, I felt something shift. Inside me, not anger, not sadness, but something steadier, something stronger, like a quiet recognition of where I actually stood, regardless of how they chose to see me. Because if they believed I was just someone who stayed here, someone who took care of things without question, then they had misunderstood something very important, something I was no longer willing to let remain invisible. That afternoon, I did not put the papers back into the drawer the way I usually would, neatly stacked and forgotten until they were needed again. Instead, I kept them on the desk, spread out in front of me, each page a quiet reminder of something that had never actually changed, even if the way I was treated had. I sat there for a long time, not rushing, not overwhelmed, just reading, letting the details settle into place with a kind of calm precision that felt new, as if I were finally seeing the structure of my own life from the outside, without the layers of habit and assumption that had blurred it for so long. The house was in my name. It always had been. The mortgage had been paid off years ago, the final payment signed by my hand, not Daniel's, not Vanessa's. The property taxes, the insurance, the maintenance, all of it traced back to me, to decisions I had made long before either of them had started talking about what should or should not happen here. I noticed small things I had not paid attention to before, dates, signatures, clauses that outlined ownership in clear, unmistakable terms, language that did not leave room for interpretation or convenience. It was all there, documented, stable, unaffected by opinions or tone or the way someone chose to introduce me in a grocery store. I leaned back slightly in the chair, letting out a slow breath, and for the first time in days, my shoulders relaxed, not because anything around me had changed, but because I had finally aligned myself with something that was still true, something that had not been rewritten without my knowledge. I thought about the conversation I had overheard, about the plans being made quietly upstairs, about the idea that this house could be discussed as if it were something they could rearrange without consequence, and I realized how easy it must have been for them to believe that, because I had allowed myself to become invisible within it, not by leaving, but by stepping back, by doing everything that was expected without asking to be acknowledged, by accepting small dismissals until they formed a pattern that felt normal. When Vanessa spoke about me as if I were temporary, it was because I had not corrected the narrative when it first began to shift. When Daniel stayed silent, it was because silence had become easier than confrontation, and I had accepted that silence as something I needed to understand rather than something that needed to change. I gathered the papers into a single, neat stack, aligning the edges carefully, the way I always did, but this time the gesture felt different, more deliberate, as if I were organizing not just documents, but a position I had neglected for too long. I stood up and walked through the house slowly, not with hesitation, but with awareness, noticing the details I had overlooked before, the furniture I had chosen, the layout I had designed, the small imperfections I had learned to live with, all of it still exactly where I had left it, unchanged beneath the surface of everything that had been layered on top. In the kitchen, I paused, resting my hand lightly on the counter, the same place where I had stood countless times, and I allowed myself a small, quiet acknowledgement of what I now understood clearly. They were making plans as if I were already gone, but I was still here. And more importantly, everything they were planning around still belonged to me, not in a symbolic way, not in a sentimental way, but in a way that was written, recorded, and legally recognized. I did not need to argue. I did not need to explain. I only needed to stop acting as if I had no place in decisions that could not exist without me. And once that thought settled into place, steady and unshaken, I realized something else just as important. I did not have to rush, because for the first time, I was no longer reacting to what they were doing. I was preparing for what I would do next. That evening, I sat at the dining table a little longer than usual, not because I had anything left to eat, but because I wanted to feel the space again, to understand how it had shifted without physically changing. And as I rested my hands lightly on the polished surface, I noticed how everything was still arranged the way I had once decided it should be. The chairs evenly spaced, the light fixture centered, the small imperfections that only I knew about still exactly where they had always been. When Vanessa came downstairs, she was already dressed for the evening, her expression focused, her movements quick and efficient as she began setting a few decorative items on the table, testing placements, adjusting angles, preparing for the dinner she had been planning. She barely glanced at me at first, as if my presence in the room was expected but not relevant, and then she spoke without looking up, her voice carrying that same casual authority I had grown used to hearing. "I was thinking we should move this table slightly closer to the window," she said, sliding one of the chairs an inch to the left. "It would make the space feel more open." I watched her for a moment before responding, my tone even, measured. "This table was placed here for a reason," I said, not raising my voice, not challenging her directly, simply stating a fact. She paused, just briefly, then gave a small smile that did not quite reach her eyes. "Well, we can update things," she replied lightly. "It is our home now. We can make it work better for us." The words settled into the room with a quiet weight, not loud, not aggressive, but unmistakable, and I noticed how easily she said our home, how naturally the phrase came to her, as if repetition had already made it true in her mind. Daniel entered a few minutes later, loosening his tie, his attention divided as usual, and Vanessa immediately turned to him, explaining her idea, her tone shifting slightly, seeking agreement, reinforcing her position. He nodded, almost automatically, glancing at the table, then at me, his expression neutral, as if he were trying to balance something he did not want to fully address. "It could look nice," he said after a moment, his voice careful, measured in a way that suggested he was choosing the path that required the least resistance. I held his gaze for just a second longer than usual, not accusing, not demanding, simply allowing the silence to stretch enough for him to feel it, and then I looked. Back at the table, my fingers tracing the edge lightly, grounding myself in something steady. "It has worked well for a long time," I said, my voice calm, almost reflective, and then I stood up, stepping away from the table without another word. I did not argue. I did not insist. I did not need to, because the conversation itself had already confirmed what I needed to know. It was not about the table. It was about ownership, about language, about the quiet assumption that decisions could be made without me because I had allowed that pattern to take root. I walked into the kitchen, rinsing a glass under the faucet, the sound of running water filling the space, soft but steady, and I listened to their voices behind me, lower now, continuing the discussion as if I had simply stepped out of the way, as if that was my role. And for the first time, I understood something clearly, something that settled into place with a kind of quiet certainty. They were not waiting for me to leave. They were already living as if I had. I did not change anything the next day, not the table, not the routine, not the way I moved through the house. And that was intentional, because I wanted them to believe that nothing had shifted, that I was still the same quiet presence they had grown used to, the one who adjusted, who accommodated, who stepped back without question. Vanessa continued her preparations for the dinner, moving through the rooms with confidence, making small adjustments, giving instructions without asking, her voice carrying through the house, as if it naturally belonged at the center of everything. I followed her directions when she gave them, setting out plates, polishing glasses, arranging napkins, each movement precise, controlled, not out of obedience, but out of clarity, because I understood now that the role she had assigned me only existed as long as I allowed it to define me. Daniel came and went throughout the day, his attention divided between work and whatever Vanessa needed, his presence brief, his involvement minimal, and I noticed how easily he moved within the structure that had been built around him, never questioning it, never pausing long enough to see it from the outside. In the afternoon, I made a quiet phone call from my room, closing the door softly behind me, dialing a number I had not used in years but still remembered without hesitation. The voice on the other end was familiar, steady, someone who had known me long before any of this began, someone who understood the details I did not need to explain. I spoke calmly, outlining what I needed, asking for copies, confirmations, updates, my tone even, my words precise, and as I listened to the responses, I felt that same quiet certainty settle deeper into place. Nothing had been changed. Nothing had been transferred. Everything remained exactly as it had been, documented, protected, unchanged by assumptions or convenience. I thanked them and ended the call without lingering, placing the phone back on the nightstand. And for a moment I stood there, looking around the room, taking in the details I had overlooked for too long, the photographs, the small personal items, the pieces of a life that had not disappeared, only been pushed into the background. When I returned downstairs, Vanessa was in the living room, reviewing her list, checking items off with quick, efficient movements, and she looked up briefly as I entered. "Can you make sure everything is ready by 5?" she asked, her tone light but expectant, as if the answer was already decided. I nodded once, my expression unchanged, and she smiled, satisfied, turning her attention back to her plans. I moved through the house quietly, completing each task, placing everything exactly where it needed to be, not because I was following her lead, but because I was preparing the space on my own terms, aligning it with something they could not see. By the time evening approached, the house looked exactly the way she wanted it to, polished, inviting, carefully arranged, and as I stood in the doorway of the dining room, looking at the table she had wanted to move, still exactly where it had always been, I felt no urgency, no need to correct anything out loud. Because the real change was not in the furniture, or the decorations, or the way the evening would unfold. It was in the fact that I was no longer invisible to myself, and that made everything else temporary, no matter how permanent they believed it to be. The guests began to arrive just before 5, their voices filling the house with a kind of brightness that felt carefully arranged, laughter echoing through the hallway, shoes stepping onto floors I had once polished myself, compliments drifting toward Vanessa as she greeted each person with effortless charm, her presence at the center of it all exactly as she had planned. I stood near the kitchen at first, just within view but not in the way, watching as coats were taken, drinks were offered, conversations unfolded naturally around the space I knew so well, and I noticed how easily they accepted everything as it was presented to them. The house, the atmosphere, the illusion of ownership that had been built piece by piece without ever being questioned. Vanessa moved through the room with confidence, introducing Daniel, guiding guests toward the dining area, explaining small details about the evening, and when one of the guests asked about me, her answer came quickly, lightly, almost as an afterthought. "Oh, she helps out around here," she said with a soft smile, her tone smooth enough that no one paused to consider it. No one looked twice, and I saw the same shift in their expressions that I had seen before, that subtle adjustment in how I was perceived, how I was placed within the structure she had created. Daniel stood beside her, nodding politely, his attention already moving to the next conversation, his silence as steady as it had been all along. I did not correct her. I did not step forward. Instead, I waited until everyone was seated, until the table was filled, until the room had settled into that comfortable rhythm of shared attention. And then I walked in, not hurried, not hesitant, simply present, carrying a small folder in my hands, the same one I had placed on the desk the day before. I took my seat at the head of the table, the chair I had always used, the one no one had formally reassigned but had quietly begun to avoid acknowledging. And for a moment, the conversation continued as if nothing had changed, until the silence found its way in naturally, one voice fading, then another, until all eyes turned toward me without quite understanding why. I placed the folder on the table gently, opening it with the same careful precision I had used when reviewing its contents, and I looked at each of them, not with anger, not with accusation, but with a calm clarity that did not need to be explained. Before dinner, I said, my voice steady, even, there is something I would like to clarify. The room stilled, the air shifting in a way that felt subtle but undeniable, and I continued without raising my tone, without adding emphasis. This house, I said, resting my hand lightly on the edge of the folder, has always been in my name. There was a pause, not dramatic, not loud, but long enough for the meaning to settle, for the words to reach beyond the surface of polite conversation. Vanessa's smile held for a second too long before it faltered slightly, her eyes flickering toward Daniel, who had gone completely still, his expression caught somewhere between surprise and realization. I did not rush to fill the silence. I did not explain further than necessary. I simply turned the first page toward them, the document clear, official, unmistakable, and then I leaned back slightly in my chair, my hands resting calmly in my lap. So while you enjoy your evening, I added, my voice quiet but firm, I thought it would be important for everyone to understand exactly where they are. No one spoke immediately. No one laughed. The room, which had been so full just moments before, felt suddenly smaller, more defined, as if the boundaries that had always existed were finally visible. I did not need to say anything else. I did not need to correct what had been said about me earlier, or the roles that had been assigned without my consent, because the truth, once placed on the table, did not require explanation. It only required acknowledgement, and whether they chose to give it or not no longer changed what I knew to be real.